Hi, my name is Chinyce, and I am so excited to be talking to you guys about the UC application. This video is going to go over several different things, including how to get started, talking about your personal insight questions, but more so focusing on what goes where in your UC application and how to show the admissions team the best side of yourself when approaching the University of California application. So, first things first, let's just start about how to get started. How to approach this big essay was way too many parts. You have, of course, the background, and then you're going to be talking about yourself in the awards and activities section, which I may refer to as the short answer questions just because they are shorter, and then the personal insight questions at the end. When you're looking at this big application with all these parts, it can be daunting and feel overwhelming, and you may even feel stuck. Like, who can I turn to? Who can I call for help? Of course, you're the one who's supposed to know you more than anyone else, but sometimes it's hard to notice things about yourself when you're just living in your own body. Talking to your friends and family is maybe one of the best ways to learn things about yourself, to put in your personal insight questions, because it's right there in the name. The applications want to know things about you. One example of this from my application is for question 3. Question 3 at the time, this was the 2020 application, so the questions always change a bit, and I'm just going to read it to you. It said, what would you say is your greatest talent or skill? How have you developed or demonstrated this talent over time? So when I was approaching this question, I wasn't exactly sure what to write. I tried to think of things that I was good at, and I thought, maybe I'm good at like working well with people. And even that was hard, because when you think about talents or skills, you think about being athletic or a great artist or a musician. Because I wasn't sure what exactly my greatest talent or skill was, I went and asked my family and friends about it. And all of them gave a resounding answer that my ability to empathize and work well with people was my greatest talent. And so that's what I ended up writing my application about, specifically my third essay about skills. Once you're done writing and have come to your final drafts or close to final drafts, you want to find a trusted mentor or family member to help you look over these essays. Now, this family member can be from an academic background, because in the culture of academia, there's a specific way you write and communicate. And if your family has been in academic spaces, has gone to higher education, then they can help you with your application, because they've already seen a college application and have a certain idea of what the applicant reviewers are looking for. However, even if your family doesn't come from an academic background, they can definitely still help you out. I personally used my family who didn't have academic backgrounds, because it was helpful for them to just read the flow of my essay and see if it sounded good and felt good after reading it. To get help from people who were in academic spaces, I first talked to my English teacher and asked him if he was willing, and he was, to read my college essays and just give me a bit of a review. And finally, I had help from a local organization that works within the Sacramento, California area, called Black Youth Leadership Project, and I was part of their specific program called GOAT. That's their specific program they have for helping students with their college application and just preparing to do all the different parts of their application. So like I said, find a trusted mentor who can help you out. For me, that was not only my family, but also mentors from church, and then a teacher from my school and a local organization that helps students with things like college applications. 2 more things to consider when getting started on your application is grammar. I'm sure you're a great person with many great talents, and the last thing that should happen is that your application is hindered because of something as small as a period, a comma, or just struggles with spelling. So maybe consider using Grammarly, which is a tool that I use. Grammarly is slightly better than using Google Docs, in my opinion, because oftentimes Grammarly will talk to you about the way your sentence sounds or flows, or it'll catch small grammatical errors that Google Docs won't. Through Black Youth Leadership Project, I was able to use Grammarly Premium, but even if you're not able to use Grammarly Premium, the free Grammarly still works pretty well. A final note for the UC application before we move on to the nitty-gritty of it is to specifically look at the major requirements when you're applying to different majors. When you're in the UC application, you can choose how many UCs you apply to and which UCs you apply to, and furthermore, which majors you apply to at a certain university. For example, I applied to UC Riverside, and I applied to the psychology major as my first choice and the creative writing major as my second choice. And then for UC Berkeley, I applied to the Letters and Science College as an undeclared major. Now, why did I apply undeclared? At UC Berkeley, for the Letters and Science College, all students are required to apply undeclared because they want freshmen to have a bit of time to figure out what they're really into and explore all their interests. Make sure to Google the different majors you're considering and their major requirements to make sure that how you apply doesn't hinder your ability to be considered as a possible student for that school. Let's get on to focusing on the different parts of your UC application and overall what goes where. So, deciding what goes in your awards and activities section. Oddly enough, if you want to decide what goes in your awards and activities section, you need to start with your personal insight questions. Well, why is that? Overall, the personal insight questions are a part of your application that works best when it's woven together and has a theme. So what is a personal insight question theme? Well, all your essays, of course, are going to exist independently of themselves and of each other and should be good essays that can stand strong on their own. However, when you have a theme that flows throughout all 4 of the different essays, it allows for your essay to feel overall just more put together and makes your application stronger. So for instance, let's talk about my personal insight questions and the theme I had. Specifically, my theme was overcoming challenges. For my first essay, in 2020, there was a question about leadership, something on the lines of, what leadership experience have you had and what skills or lessons did you learn from it? So for that essay, I wrote about when I volunteered with a program where K-12 students had a week-long summer camp, and I personally was working as a lead to help with kindergarten students. I focused on a student who oftentimes struggled with listening and working with the teachers. And many of the other teachers or leaders regarded him as a problem child and didn't want to deal with him and often wanted to send him home. However, I took as much extra time as I could throughout that week to talk to him and support him and encourage him to express himself using his words rather than hitting or attacking the other children. That essay, of course, showed how I'm able to be a leader in a surrounding even when people are suggesting I do something different. But also it focused on the challenge of overcoming when a student doesn't want to work well, or just the challenge of overcoming how do I approach this child's behavior. The next essay that I did was related to creativity, and it basically said something close to, everyone has a creative side, what's your creative side, tell us about it. That's close to what the question said. So for the creative question, I talked about my involvement in speech and debate, as well as my passion for creative writing. But what I focused on was just how I overcome the challenge of being just a new student who didn't know anything about the debate. As a freshman, I hadn't participated in speech and debate before, but many people at my high school had started speech and debate in middle school. So during that essay, I talked about learning the skill and overcoming the challenge of just being the new kid who, unlike many of their other peers, was unable to begin the craft of speech and debate at an earlier time. For my third essay, like I talked to you guys about, I focused on my greatest skill. The different challenges I talked about was in the specific essay were related to specific instances where I was struggling while working with people. I talked about a friend who I had got in a disagreement with and how I communicated with that friend and was able to overcome the disagreement instead of breaking off the friendship. So that was a personal example of working well with people. And then in an academic sense, I also talked about having issues when in a group project and navigating that so that we were able to overall get the group project done and navigating my own emotions. And then finally, my final essay, the question was similar to what academic challenges have you faced and how did you overcome them? For that question, I talked about my struggles with English class and not being able to keep up with the reading sometimes, just pace out the books we're going at, and how eventually I was able to turn to audiobooks as a study strategy to be able to keep up with the class and exceed in a subject where previously I wasn't doing well. Overall, we see a theme of overcoming. So each of these essays were unique and had differences in themselves, but regardless of how they were different, they all had a theme that was woven together that made my application as a whole work better than I believe it would have if it hadn't had a theme that wove all these essays together. Overall, when you're writing your UC application, be it the awards and activities section or the personal insight question, always consider, what am I telling the UC application readers about myself? Let's move on to the final section, which is talking about how to make a strong awards and activities section. So what are you considering when you're putting things into your awards and activities section? Well, consider time or attendance, how long you were part of the program, how much you participated. Secondly, you want to consider your leadership or your contributions. And thirdly, you want to consider if it's redundant. Those are the 3 main points that we're going to talk about, plus a few others, and of course, many examples to illuminate how I chose what I put in my awards and activities section. So first, time and attendance. A great example are essays that I've already talked about, speech and debate, and my experience in volunteering in church specifically. I brought those up many times in different ways because, for one, I spent 4 years in debate and 3 years as a church volunteer, and therefore I showed that I was dedicated and put much time into something that I was passionate about, and more so just am not flimsy, in the wind, always doing many things, but stay consistent. Secondly, talking about leadership positions / your contribution. Going back to the example of church, I talked about this in different sections because there were different positions I had. Maybe you're not the leadership of a club, but you're always dedicating time and you're always providing materials or providing insight, and people regard you as someone who's valuable to the team or club. And then if you have a leadership position, of course, it's something to mention because leadership, all in all, is just a good skill to have. And that also tied into my awards. I won an Outstanding Service Award for the amount of time I put into volunteering at church. So again, consider the amount of time, leadership position, and important contributions you made, and those are interchangeable. Thirdly, consider, is it redundant? For instance, like I said, I talked about different things I did at my church. So in one awards and activities section, I mentioned how I volunteered at nighttime with the middle school, high school service. And then in another section, I mentioned how I volunteered at the kids camp that I mentioned earlier, where during the summer I would work with younger students and volunteer with helping with that. So that is 2 times I mentioned the same thing, but then I mentioned it a third time in my personal insight question, and that was still fine because I described the ways the first 2 activities were unique. And then it was good that I mentioned the summer camp program in my awards and activities section because it allowed for me to have less explaining to do in my personal insight question, because the application readers already knew what that program was. I had very briefly mentioned, oh, I was in this program, this is what the program is about. That's almost everything you get to say in your awards and activity section, so not much. But since I put that activity, when I went into much more vivid detail, the admissions team had already been introduced to this activity that I was doing. And the last thing to consider is it relevant? Is it related to the major you are considering? I was involved in a lot of programs that were focused on political engagement. One of them was the Black Youth Leadership Project that I mentioned before, and I was also secretary 1 year for Black Women Organized for Political Engagement. I went to a lot of events, and I participated in Lobby Day for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So I mentioned all of these things in my awards and activities section because it shows that I've been introduced to policy and how that works, and I'm engaged politically in my community. But I didn't mention this in my personal insight questions. Why? All in all, because I didn't have too much to talk about. I'm not saying that in a negative way. What I'm explaining is, if you're choosing something to be in your personal insight question, you should have a lot to say. You should be passionate about it. I was very interested in the issues that all of these organizations that I mentioned previously. While I was passionate about the politic, my personal focus for my college years is much more rooted in film, more so than it is policy. The policy, of course, relates. I may make film that talks about important issues that I learned about in those programs, but I don't plan to become someone who is politically active in the same way that I was in the past. So I didn't write essays about them. They didn't go in my personal insight question, but they still went in my application because they showcase skills and things that I learned. For the last thing, we're just going to talk about the awards section because we focused a lot for this video on activities, but I do want to cover awards. So the 2 things that I want you to consider is, of course, competitive level. That's something they ask about in the application. How competitive is it? So it's apparent that they recognize or put more merit on competitions that are more competitive, but also you can add it in if it's something that was important to you. So the 2 examples I have is for speech and debate. I mentioned 2 different competitions, one where I've got 10th place and one where I was a quarter finalist. And the reason I mentioned these competitions instead of events where I'd won higher places such as 3rd place and 7th place is because I had won 3rd and 7th place at the local level, so there was a smaller amount of people I was competing against. It was less competitive. Furthermore, I also mentioned when I won a competition, I just saw it on Instagram. It was called the Girls Rule Foundation Poetry Contest. It's actually a program rooted in Arizona, but a friend of mine sent it to me and I sent in a video, and I won for most powerful poem, But the reason I mentioned this in my application had nothing to do with the application pool or how many people competed. I honestly didn't know if a lot of people competed or not. This was important for me emotionally and personally and related to my growth, because I was not sure if I wanted to work more on poetry and if that was something that I was good at and wanted to explore more. So submitting that poem and getting a good award was just affirming for me that this was a skill that I could learn and get good at if I wanted to. No matter what, just do your best and use these tips, and I'm sure your UC application will reflect just how great you are. Thanks for stopping by. Have a wonderful rest of your day.